We're going to focus on the Sustainable Developmental Goals, or in Spanish, los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible, in connection to or with an area in Mexico called Chiapas, and also focusing on grammar aspects of the Spanish language, which is the imperative. We will also have the opportunity to see what kind of tasks we can engage with in order to learn more about the topic in conjunction with the grammar that we need to cover. ¿Qué cosas sabes sobre Mexico? We're going to start thinking about things that you may already know or may have learned about Mexico. And you can pause here, you can write a list of things that come to mind. See what I've produced here, a list of some bits of information which I want to read. Es el tercer país más grande de América Latina. Es el 10º país más poblado del mundo. Es el 13º país más extenso del mundo. La frontera con Estados Unidos es de 3.155 kilómetros. Es uno de los 17 países megadiversos del planeta, con del 10 al 12% de la biodiversidad mundial. El español es la lengua oficial junto con 67 lenguas indígenas. So, notice the information contains quite a bit about numbers. Numbers are relevant here. It's important to bear that in mind. It's good to be able to read numbers in different forms. And also notice how we are having an acronym here. Estados Unidos is written normally this way to shorten, because it's quite a long word. So just be aware of that. And next time you see it written, you know what it is. More things about México concern the distribution of the indigenous population. Esta es la distribución de la población indígena en México. The highest concentration towards the south of the country, and you can see the percentages on the left-hand side. So the whole of the country contains or has indigenous population to a greater or lesser degree. Hay una distribución variable de la población indígena, con una concentración más alta en los estados del sur. We're going to focus on one of these states called Chiapas. As you can see here, I've located these states. We're going to see more states in the next image. We have different names here. You can learn, you can practice the pronunciation by reading them out. And notice, by the way, how we should read that X contained, for example, in this name, as a J. So we would say Oaxaca. And when we read the word Mexico, again, that X is read like a J. So that's something to bear in mind. Let's move on to some information about the state of Chiapas. And in particular, this area within Chiapas called Los Altos de Chiapas. It's a very high region at 2,880 meters above the sea level, 2,880 metros sobre el nivel del mar. Es una zona alta, it's a very high area. And one of the things that even the pictures can speak, the relevance of nature and water in that region is a very rich region in natural resources. Es una región con grandes recursos naturales. El medio ambiente es importante, yeah? So the environment is important here, and this is something that brings us to the main focus of attention. You are very welcome to explore this topic with some of the links that I will facilitate later on, but just as a very quick summary, some of the objectives, the Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible, are relevant for this region because one of the main resources, the water, is not exactly well managed. And of course, this has consequences for the local population, health consequences primarily, but of course, quality of living is also impinged by this lack of proper access and management of water. So, as you can see, el objetivo de desarrollo sostenible número 6 consiste en garantizar la disponibilidad de agua y su gestión sostenible y el saneamiento para todos. So, this objective is seeking to guarantee the availability of water and its sustainable management and the kind of keeping this water clean for everybody. I want to read this text And you can see that there are some keywords I have highlighted as these are words that you may want to make a point of learning, because it's just a way to facilitate your speaking about topics such as these, or being able to understand them better. La falta de agua potable o el agua de mala calidad tienen consecuencias en la seguridad alimentaria y en los medios para subsistir de muchas personas en el mundo. Gestionar de forma sostenible los recursos hídricos en el mundo es fundamental para lograr y dar acceso al agua potable y al saneamiento para todos. So, water management is key. Basically, that's the message of this objective. Another objective that is important to achieve concerns how cities are meant to be safe places, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable. So that would be Objective 11. El objetivo 11. Las ciudades deben convertirse en espacios seguros, inclusivos, resilientes y sostenibles. Another objective that is relevant for this area is objective number 12. Objetivo 12. Garantizar modalidades de consumo y producción sostenibles. El consumo no sostenible produce contaminación y degrada el medio ambiente. Por lo tanto, es necesario apostar por sistemas de producción que respeten o que respetan el entorno de forma sostenible. So, ways of consumption, the modes of consumption are important. They have to be sustainable in order to guarantee some respect for the environment. And therefore, we need to understand that anything that pollutes or degrades the environment is an issue. So we need to support systems of production that actually support the environment. And here we have an image of a lorry Coca-Cola distributor, which is relevant for the context of Chiapas, where there's a factory, there's a lot of high extraction of water per day to produce this particular product. It's accessing rich aquifers at the same time that the population, the local population, doesn't have good access to water, which is an essential resource. Therefore, there's some form of inequality here, and indeed, it's a questionable practice that a company is exploiting these natural resources at the same time that the local population has no proper access to them. So you can start maybe seeing the sketch of the issue and how these objectives that still need to be met are potentially helpful in framing what the problem is and how to start seeking solutions for it. Another objective, el objetivo 3, is important as well here in this context because it says, it aims to the following: garantizar una vida sana y promover el bienestar para todos en todas las edades. As I have just mentioned, the fact that the access of water is not well managed, this has, and the fact that Coca-Cola is very accessible in this area and that it's cheaper to obtain than water, poses a number of health issues for the local population, especially the indigenous population, as there's a high level of indigenous population here, and it's to do with the consequences of drinking far too much Coca-Cola a day per person. So I think the average is beyond 2 liters a day per person, and this creates huge problems connected to high blood pressure, diabetes, and obesity, which together with COVID-19, which is already known that is creating more risk for population that have these underlying conditions, you can start seeing how this is an issue that goes beyond the purely environmental sort of territory and goes into health related and fairness in the management of water and its consequences. Some students, after engaging with some of the resources that I provided on this situation, on this issue, produced a list of ideas concerning what to do, the way they capture some of the ideas that they thought were important to highlight and express as potential solutions as well as ways to make this visible, this problem more visible. I'm going to read through them, and then I'm going to explain how this is useful for us in order to use the imperative, which we're going to learn a bit more about in a minute. Tiene que haber una mejor educación sobre el impacto o los impactos negativos de beber tanta Coca-Cola. El gobierno debe priorizar la salud de las personas, no la ganancia financiera o el beneficio económico. Las organizaciones internacionales y ONGs deben actuar. La empresa de Coca-Cola tiene una responsabilidad de cuidar a sus consumidores. Coca-Cola debe proveer la opción de productos con menos azúcar para mejorar la salud de los consumidores. El gobierno debería crear mejores redes de distribución de agua para dar acceso a la población a este recurso básico. O deberían aumentar el precio de la Coca-Cola y bajar el precio del agua. Deberíamos crear conciencia sobre el problema a través de las redes sociales y los anuncios. Tendríamos que ponernos en contacto con los gobernadores de Chiapas. Tendrían que advertir a la población sobre los riesgos y los peligros del sobreconsumo de Coca-Cola. So these are some of the ideas. How can we turn them into calls for action or calls to action? We need the imperative for that, because this is a tense, this is a mode that allows us to express this idea of getting something done, either by demanding somebody to do it or by saying or encouraging other people to do it with us. So how is the imperative tense and mode being put together? We're going to look first, and at this point, only at the affirmative or the imperative that is only making positive statements. A number of things to know about how to conjugate this tense. One of the things is that we still have to consider the three different groups of verbs we have seen in the context of learning other tenses. Another thing to notice is that we're not going to look at a form for yo, for the first person singular, because we're not going to use this form to call to ourselves to action unless we're forming part of a group, and therefore nosotros is relevant. Another thing to notice is that a verb that is a stem changing verb in the simple present tense is going to show irregularities in the stem as well in the imperative. And you have a few examples already to illustrate that. First of all, let's look at how we proceed in order to conjugate. We are going to take the main stem of the verb, what is left when you remove the infinitive ending. We keep that, and to that we would consider using these endings to express who is being called for action, so to say. So here we have the different persons to indicate whether it's you singular or you formal singular, or we, or you plural, or you plural formal. So we have a big divide between formal and informal, and then also whether we include ourselves in the call for action or not. Some examples of the conjugation, you have it here. We have just a regular verb among the other verbs that actually are showing irregularities in the stem, because these are stem changing verbs as well in the simple present tense. And they show the stem irregularity in the same persons that you would see are relevant in the present tense. So the second person and the third person are affected, not the first and second person plural, but again, the third person plural is affected by these irregularities, and there's a change in the stem. Basically, that's what is happening. So we are slightly familiar with that. So we have to take care of that. And then is when, once we have sorted the stem, we can then consider the endings, and then we have the imperative already put together. So this would be, in essence, the way that we have to go about conjugating. Notice here it says, la forma vosotros siempre es regular en el radical. So this is important to consider. This is always going to be regular in the stem, vosotros. Okay, so some things that will help you to work out the form of the imperative. When we move to the second group verbs, still we have to be aware of the fact that you could be dealing with stem changing verbs, and you can see two examples here with querer and volver, showing that stem change in the positions, in the persons that we would expect them to be. The same procedure, we have the stem as a starting point that you may have to modify first if it is a stem changing verb, and then we have a different set of endings, variations of the previous one. So there's a kind of alternation of e an a D for the form of vosotros. That's a characteristic across all the different groups. Also an N for the third person plural, MOS as a form of ending for the first person plural. And well, these features are going to hopefully help you to remember the form that it takes finally the verb, but be careful with the variation of vowels. They don't fall in the same places, so you have to be watchful of that. One more thing to say at this point is that there are some changes that you may see happening in verbs that produce a phonetic adjustment. And this phonetic adjustment is based on a tendency to match the sounds that are presented in the infinitive. So for this particular example, conocer, you have that th sound in the infinitive, and it's something that we aspire to retain. We would not be able to retain that sound if we had not placed a Z before the C. And that's a way in which the verb kind of retains this sort of memory of what the infinitive is doing. It doesn't happen everywhere, because in this case, for example, the combination of the C plus the E keeps that sound intact. So to say, you say conoce, so that th sound is still present. But here, if we had not done that, we would have to say conozca, and definitely there's a change in sound of the C becoming a K sound. So we are restoring the th sound with the presence of the Z. So that's the justification for that Z being there. Finally, when we move to the third group verbs, again, we have to consider another set of endings, slightly a variation of what we saw before, particularly for the form vosotros, second person plural. And again, you would see stem changing verbs showing the stem change where you would expect this stem change to be. And also you have another verb that produces phonetic adjustments to match the original sound in the infinitive, plus the fact that I have included now here some reflexive verbs where you have to consider activating the reflexive pronoun whenever you are conjugating the verb, matching the person you are aiming at expressing by using a particular form of the verb. So if you want to say to somebody to get dressed, and that's the second person singular, you need to say vístete, and that is that te is there matching the fact that we are implying tú, second person singular. Notice how the stem change is also present. The moment we want to just appeal to a different audience, talk to some other people, and in this case, if we were to treat them formally and there's more than one person, you would have to say vístanse. It happens that the third person plural as well as the third person singular keep that se that you can see in the infinitive. So you don't see a change there, but you would see it in the second and the first and second person plural. So things to consider, as well as the stem changing again in this particular one, this particular verb. Another note connected to the imperative is that reflexive verbs in the second person plural are going to lose the D, as you can see. They don't keep that typical D characteristic of the second person plural when you have reflexive verbs, with the exception of the form of the verb to go that is reflexive. This verb will keep the D, but this is the exception to the rule. You may have to construct a phrase where you are replacing the direct and the indirect object with pronouns. This is an example, like canta una canción a tu amiga may have to be transformed because of the linguistic requirements. You already know what you're talking about. You don't need to repeat these words, and you need the pronouns to substitute these parts of the phrase. And then what happens is that you are going to add these pronouns at the end of the imperative form, and you're going to be attaching these things and then forming just a single word as a result. So you can say this phrase as cántasela. La is there for the direct object, se is there for the indirect object. And you know that when we have both the direct and the indirect object becomes se. So that's all what's happening there. It has implications for the emphasis being changed when we are piling pronouns to the original canta, the original imperative form. The emphasis or the need for the rules of accentuation change, and therefore we need to have that accent on top of the A that was not there when you have a shorter word. This is useful, but we still need to know a bit more about the imperative, which is the important fact that there are some irregular verbs. These are, in essence, some of the most important, more relevant verbs that present irregularities, that don't follow exactly rules that we have seen applying to the other verbs. You will see still characteristics that have a link with what we have seen before, like having a D characteristic that is affecting the second person plural still there. And also you have the typical ending for the second person, the first person plural, and the end for the third person plural. So there are a few things, a few features that still remain, but certainly you can see in the form for two quite a range of variation, and certainly not necessarily following the procedure we have followed for the other verbs. One of the best things to do is just try to use these verbs, try to become very familiar with them so that you don't have to think too much about how to go about conjugating them, or just devise your own sort of rules based on a pattern that you may want to establish to remember this. But this is really very much capturing the most important irregular verbs you need to know about. Why do we need to know all these things? Because as I said before, we are trying to produce some calls for action. Starting points are the phrases I read before, and I have a few examples of what not to do and of what to do, so that you have an idea of the type of approach you have to have in order to process these phrases. You need to understand the message in the first place. Just try to capture the idea behind the initial starting point, the phrase given to you, and then transform that, capture what is really the action, what is that is going to be the verb that you're going to use to actually carry the message of the action you want to demand or to ask for. In this case, it would be the word educación. So I've highlighted all the keywords that are relevant just to facilitate the process of working with imperative in this context. And we are going to then consider how to go from the noun to the verb and just produce a call for action. So we're saying here that there has to be a better education on the negative impacts of drinking so much Coca-Cola. So we can say we want them, could be the government or somebody in charge, to educate about the negative impact of drinking so much Coca-Cola. So educate would be the call for action. And therefore we need to think, okay, this is educar in Spanish, it's a first group verb. You can then go back to how you decide which ending is going to be the one you need. Depends on who you're thinking you are addressing. So you have to consider what person is going to be implied by the ending. You need to get rid of the AR, and what is left normally would be the starting point for adding the endings. However, with educar, we need to keep this phonetic h, k sound that we hear in the infinitive, which would be lost if we just simply add to the stem the relevant ending. So we need to transform that C into Q, U, and then to that add the ending. So we will end up saying eduque or eduquen. Therefore, you need to consider making a phonetic adjustment for that to work. With these examples, I'm just trying to show that this has not quite captured the way it should be done. It's not just about changing one of the verbs. Here, haber and tener have been picked up as the thing to act upon, but this is not how you have to think about this. I hope this has illustrated a bit how to do it. Here we have another example of getting closer to do what you are supposed to do. Basically, the keyword is certainly priorizar, is the action that we want to demand from somebody, but it's actually in the process of creating the imperative that things have not gone so well. So you have to consider how to follow the steps that take you to end up with the right form of the verb. So that would be the problem in the second case. For the third example, you have the right transformation. The keyword was actuar. in the main message, and we want that international organizations and NGOs act. So you could say organizaciones internacionales y ONGs actúen. Yeah, so call for action for these particular subjects. And then you can see that we have already established which keywords are the ones you need to be concerned about. So this is one of the tasks that you can engage with in order to practice the use of the imperative in a meaningful context. We actually want to create calls for action for a real problem, and we already have quite a bit of material there to do that. The last suggestion is something to do with another objective, which is to do with consumption, and not only about water, although it is including water, as this is so far the main topic we were focusing on. The management of water or the consumption of water is an issue, but there are other issues connected to sustainable consumption. And each of us can do something, and it's not necessarily a big type of action, but daily routines that we are going to revisit in our minds can be the base for us to produce some advice, some ideas that we can express with imperative, to list the kinds of actions that you think are important to be done in concerning the different dimensions of this objective, in this case, number 12. So, consumo sostenible del agua, hábitos para disminuir los residuos, so habits to do with dealing with diminishing or reducing waste, hábitos para ahorrar energía, so how to save energy, modos de desplazamiento respetuosos y sostenibles, so how you can move about, go to places in a respectful and sustainable way, estrategias para ahorrar alimentos, how we can save in our consumption of food, how can we organize ourselves to make a better use of this resource. Consumo ético, compra responsable y solidaria, so this is to do with the ethic dimension of consumption, where these products come from, who is producing them, is it responsible, is it solidarious, and so on. Consumo crítico, so being critical about what we are eating, what we are buying, looking at the labels, checking where it's being produced, how much it costs, if it costs not too much, is it right to buy it, are you supporting perhaps a type of consumption that is not sustainable and is actually unfair for the people that are engaging in producing it, so on. And then finalmente, turismo sostenible. So going on holidays, is it just about enjoying a place, engaging with a place, in which way, what type of place is going to be the one you're going to go to, and why you're going to that particular place, and so on. And then you have a number of indicators here of different resources you can access to get more information about sustainable consumption and the environmental impact. You will also have information on the comment section, but just consider this as an opportunity to reflect, an opportunity to use tools such as vocabulary and grammar connected to the imperative, and put messages together that are actually relevant for joining a conversation that is taking place and is very much an impactful conversation and one that we need to have. In this map, we have kind of highlighted areas which give us the indicator of the degree in which these countries are engaging with a green economy. So an economy that is based in being mindful about how resources are being used, how consumption is being regulated, and so on. Just to give you a sense of how much more work we still have to be done for it to be a global activity. And that's it for now. And good luck with your imperative, with your call for action, and let's meet up some other time.